Now, if you're using Go to build backend applications and you don't want the complexity of JavaScript, it makes sense to use something like HTMX for simple application. And in this video, I want to introduce a stack that's informally called the GoTH Stack. And we're going to build a small app using this stack. So what does this contain? Well, it contains Go for the programming language. We also have HTMX, which helps us build interactive web pages. And we're using a package called Templ, and that's the T part of this stack. And I've seen some definitions that use Tailwind instead of Templ. But whatever it is, we're going to use both of them in this video. Now, I'm preparing a larger course on this stack that's going to include database integration, sessions in Go, authentication, and more. But we're going to start simple here. So this is what we're going to build here. We're not going to focus on styles, as you can see, but we have a simple list page listing different countries in the world. And when we click through to those countries, we get a detail page and it adds the country name to the URL. We're going to build these pages with Templ components, and we're going to use template composition to extend from a base Templ component. And we're also going to integrate HTMX in this active search bar here. So when the user types in, it's going to delay this request by 1 second, and then it's going to send an HTMX GET request to the backend. Go is then going to serve that request, and it's going to return a Templ component rendered to HTML as the response, and that's then going to be swapped into the DOM. And this is going to demonstrate how simple it is to integrate HTMX into a Templ component and have those different components and subcomponents returned as responses in your Go handler functions. So that's what we're going to build in this video, and if you find the content useful, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the channel, check out this Ko-fi page that we have under the video. So let's dive in, and we're going to look at the Templ documentation to start with. And this package allows you to create components that render fragments of HTML and then compose them to create screens, pages, documents, or apps. And it contains features such as server-side rendering, static rendering, the ability to compile the Templ components into Go code. And you can use Go within these components, for example, embedding if statements, switch, and for statements into the code. And that allows you to perform conditional logic and looping within your templates. And you can see below here some simple Templ components. We have a hello component that accepts a name as a parameter, and that is then rendered inside a div, as you can see here, and it uses the curly braces to refer to a dynamic value. And we have a second component here that takes in a person object. So that's going to be a structure, for example, that contains a name field. And you can see here within the div in the greeting component, we're using composition of these Templ components, and that is done with this syntax here. And we pass the name field into that as a parameter. Now what happens with these components is they are compiled into Go code. And if we look on the left-hand sidebar here, we've got a project structure page. I just want to open that just now. And I'll leave a link to this below the video. There's an example counter application. And typically the Templ components are stored in a components directory. So we're going to loosely follow this in the video. We're going to have a folder for components, a folder for our HTTP handlers, and we're going to add a couple of extra things for the application. Now let's have a look at the starter code here. So I'm going to open VS Code, and if we go to the go.mod file, we have a module here called goth countries. So yeah, that's what we're going to call this. And you can check out the starter code on GitHub by using the link in the description. Now if we look at the data.go file, this is a simple package that contains a structure for the country. And there are some fields in there, and we have some hard-coded countries within this slice. So we've got Japan, we've got Brazil, and we've got France within this slice. So rather than using a database, we're just going to have this in-memory countries variable available within the program. And if we go to main.go, this is where the main function is. So we're creating an HTTP server, and we have 3 functions here that we're going to fill out throughout this video. The first one is a simple GET request that's going to return a list of the countries. The second one is a GET request for an individual country. And finally, we have a search endpoint that's going to use HTMX. And these are all going to use handler functions, and for now these functions are simply returning 404 not found. So we have the 3 functions, we're going to fill them in this video. Now what I'm going to do to start with is create that components directory here within the sidebar. And this is where we're going to store the Templ components that we're going to render as responses in each of these handler functions. Now of course, before we get started with that, we need to install Templ. So let's open up the documentation and let's go to the quick start installation page. And actually, let's load up this page here on creating a simple Templ component. And what you can do is initialize a project, and we can copy the go get command. We're going to go to VS Code, and I'm going to paste that in here, and that's going to install Templ. And if we look at the go.mod file, you can see we have currently an indirect import. So that's now a dependency of this project. And now that Templ is installed, let's get started and define the country list page. So we already have the handler, it's returning not found at the moment. Within the components directory, let's create a new file. and I'm going to call this countries.templ. So notice the extension there, .templ. This is where we're going to store some Templ components for the country list page. Now what we want to do here is define a package called components following the directory structure, and I want to import the models into this application. So if we look at the country.go file, this is the country model that we're going to use within the Templ component, as we're about to see in a second. So we're importing the models package. We can then define a component, so let's just copy some of the code from the documentation here. We've got a Templ component called hello. I'm going to copy that for now, and let's paste it in here. And let's change the name of this to country list. And this is going to accept as a parameter some countries, and that's going to be a slice of type models.country. And we can also remove this here from the div. Now you might notice that there's no syntax highlighting here. So I'm going to add an extension to VS Code. So let's go to the extensions section here. And we can search for this extension called Templ VS Code and install that. And that's going to provide that syntax highlighting. And that's going to make the developer experience a lot better. So if we go back to the file now, you can see it looks much better. So let's move on and actually define the code in this Templ component. So within the div, I want to give it an ID of country list, and that's going to be important because later on, when we get a response from HTMX, we want to target this ID. So we're going to give it that ID explicitly. And what we want to do is loop over all of the countries that are coming in as a parameter, and we can use the GoRange function for that. So let's use the range function over the countries that are passed in. And I'm just going to paste some HTML code in here. Let me clean this up a little bit by indenting some of that. So within the range statement for each country, we have a div. We also have a header that contains a link to a country detail page, and as text it renders out the name of the country. So the country structure contains a name field. That's what's rendered out. And for the value of an href attribute, Templ will expect you to provide a safe URL instead of just a string as the rest of the attributes are. So we use the templ.safeURL function, and that's going to mark the string that you pass in here to the href tag as being safe for use. So this Templ component takes a slice of countries, and it loops over each one of them using a for loop within the component, and it renders some information about that country, and it's going to do that for all of the countries that are passed in with this slice. And it demonstrates some features of these Templ components, for example, the ability to loop over values, and the ability to pass in type-safe data as parameters. Now once we've created the component, what we can do is compile this into Go code. So I'm going to clear the terminal, and there's a command we can run from Templ, and that's the Templ generate command. Now when that completes, notice on the left hand side that it creates this countries templ.go file, and if we look at that, it contains some auto-generated code. So it's translated that Templ component into these functions. For example, this one here called country list, this directly maps to the component that we created here. Now we can call the generated function country list within our handler function. So let's go to the handlers directory and load up the handlers.go file. And at the top of this file, I'm going to update the imports here. So we're going to bring in the components and also the models package. And let's target this function here, this handler function, and we're going to remove the http.notfound call. Now let's get the component here. To do that, we're going to reference the components package, and we can call that function country list. And remember, that was the auto-generated function, and we're going to pass models.countries into that. Now let's go to the definition of this. This is the hard-coded list of countries. So basically we take that from this package and we're going to pass it into the country list function as a parameter. And then when you have the Templ component, what you can do is call its render function, and we can pass any context from the request into that. And the second parameter to render is the response writer object. Now what we can do is start the server. So I'm going to save this and let's run go run main.go. That's going to start the server. And if we then navigate to localhost 8080, we can see we get the countries, and it's not particularly nice. We're not going to focus too much on styling here, but we are rendering the countries here. And the way this is working is by taking that Templ component, it's looping over all of the countries that are passed in as a parameter, and it's rendering the header and then also some extra data from that country's struct. Now this renders some HTML, but it's not a properly formatted HTML response. It doesn't contain, for example, the root HTML tag. So what we can do is define a base Templ component. So in the components directory, let's create a new file here called base.templ. And what I'm going to do here is just paste in some code. So let's paste this in and we'll look at this code now. So we define another component here called base, and that takes a title, which is going to be the title of the web page, as a parameter. And that contains the boilerplate code, for example, the head tag here, and it renders out that title within the title HTML tag. And we also have the body here, and we have a very simple navbar. You can imagine that the navbar is shared among different pages, so you can put that here. This isn't a proper navbar, it's just demonstrating what you could do. And then you have the title of the page as an H1 tag at the top. And then notice this here. The content of any children of this particular component is going to be rendered at this place within the body tag. Now this goes into the topic of template composition. So if we go back to the Templ documentation, within the syntax and usage section, if we go to near the bottom of that, and it's actually here in the middle, we have a page on template composition. So you can compose different Templ components to build larger web pages. And that's going to be useful later on when we return a partial Templ component as a response to an HTMX request. Now we use this syntax here, it's the @ sign, and that refers to another component. So in the show all component here, it's including the content from the left, the middle, and the right components. What we want to do is we want to include the base component that we've just created. So let's go back to VS Code and go to countries.templ, and we want this content here to be the child that's passed to the base component. So what we can do here is we can reference that base component, and we're going to pass that title into that. So let's just say countries of the world for the country list page. And then we can open up the curly braces, and for any children or any child content, we can then paste that in here, and I'm going to tab that over. So this content here is the children of this base component, and that's going to be therefore rendered here using this children tag. Now what we can do is save this, and I'm going to stop the Go server, and we can rerun that Templ generate command, and that's going to generate the Templ or generate the Go code from these components. Notice here on the left hand side we now have the base templ.go file, and if we start up the Go server again, so go run main.go, let's go back to the browser and notice at the top, for example, the title is not present and there's no header on this page. If we refresh the page, we now have some more information. So the page has a title, we have the header that's passed in, and we have this fake navbar appearing at the top. So that's now a properly formed HTML page, and the way we're doing this is by defining a base component here. So that's a base Templ component, and all of the other components we write for different pages in our web application, they can extend essentially this Templ component, and that way we don't have to rewrite all of this boilerplate code every time we have a new page. Now notice if we go back to the page and we click one of the country names, that's an anchor tag, and it should take us to a detail page. But currently this says 404 not found. So what we're going to have to do is create a new Templ component for the detail page and then render that within the handler. So let's now move on to the country detail page. And again, we're going to create a Templ component. So I'm going to call this country.templ. And I'm going to paste this code in here just to make this a little bit quicker. So what we're doing is similar to what we did before. It's in the components package, and we have a Templ component called country detail. And again, that's inheriting from the base Templ component. So it's going to properly form this HTML. And we don't need to write the head tag and the body tag, for example. We just define this content that's within the body tag. And this is a very simple page. It just renders some information on the detail page about the country that's passed in. So notice this time we don't have a slice. We're actually passing in an individual country. And we're going to look that up from the URL as we're about to see in the handler function. And there are different fields on the country struct, for example, the name and the capital city of that country. And notice here we have the population, which is a numerical value. And if you're rendering those in a Templ component, you need to convert that to a string. So for example, here we're using the integer to ASCII function. And that comes from this package in the Go standard library. So that's a pretty simple Templ component for the country detail page. Let's stop the server now at the bottom. And again, we're going to run Templ generate. That's going to create the Go code for this component. And if we go to handlers.go, we're going to now fill in the function here for the detail page. So let's remove the not found call. And we need to get the country that we actually want to look up here. If we go back to main.go and look at the URL that's defined here, we have this path value called name. So the country name is going to be passed to the URL. And of course, you might want to use something like an ID if you have that. So we need to look up what this name is within the handler function. So let's go back to that. And we'll create a variable called name. And we're going to use the request object here. And that has a function called path value. So that's going to return the value for the named path wildcard in the 𝗏𝗵𝗽𝗀 pattern that matched the request. And if we look at what we defined, that was name. So we called it name, as we can see here. So we're going to look that up in the URL. And we're then going to loop over all of the countries in this models.countries slice. So we don't need the index, and we can get the country here. And we're using the range function over models.countries. And then we're going to check if the individual country that we're iterating over, if the name of that country is equal to the name that we got from the URL. In that case, what we're going to do is create the component. So again, we're going to use the components package. And this time we're going to call the country detail function that was generated. And we pass in the individual country into that function, because if we look at country.templ, it's expecting that individual country. And just like before, we can copy the component.render call. So we can copy that and paste it in here. And once we've rendered that, we can just return from this function. So that's going to handle the case where we do find a country with the given name. What I'm going to do is just copy this http.notfound. If we go through the for loop and we don't render a component and return, we can just return not found for that given country. Now I'm going to restart the server and go back to the browser. And this time, if we refresh this page, you can see we get the details for Japan. Now there's some duplication of headers here, you might want to remove that. But we have the information about Japan coming from the struct that was passed into the Templ component with that data dynamically rendered in the component and returned from the handler function. So we now have a list page, and we also have a detail page here that displays the details of an individual country. And Templ makes it very simple to render this dynamic content, and also to iterate over slices and use conditional statements when you're actually generating your templates. And you can also use template composition to reduce the boilerplate within the code that you're writing. Now what about HTMX, which is of course an important part of this GoTH stack? What we're going to do here is we're going to create a search bar, and we're going to allow users to search for individual countries within this list page. So that's going to be an active search pattern. So let's get started with implementing that. So the first thing we need to do, of course, is install HTMX. I'm just going to use a CDN for this video and copy the link tag. There'll be a link to this page just below the video. And what we can do, because we're sharing these components, or rather we're composing these components from a base template, we can go to base.templ, and within the head tag, we can paste this in. So that's going to bring HTMX into the application, and any component that inherits from this base template or extends this base template is going to have HTMX available. So we're now going to go to countries.templ, where we have the country list. But what I want to do here is create a new Templ component, and we're going to change the structure of this page a little bit. So let's create a component called countries, and this is going to take this slice as a parameter, and that's going to be the parent component for this page. And we're again going to use template composition here to render the country list child as part of this countries component. So I hope that makes sense, and I think it will make more sense when we write the code. What I'm going to do is bring this inheritance up to the top here for the base Templ component. And the country list is not going to inherit from base, it's just going to render a list of the countries. And we need to remove that curly brace at the bottom, and we can tab this over to clean that up. So the idea here is that this country list is going to be part of the larger countries page. And in this countries page, we're going to include a search bar, and that's going to use HTMX to search over the country list. Now within this countries page, let's add the search bar. And to begin with, this is going to be very simple. We have an input element of type search within this div. And underneath the div, what I want to do is again use that template composition, and let's reference the country list component. And we're going to pass through these countries that came in as a parameter. So now this content here will be rendered underneath the search bar. And if we stop the server, we can run templ generate in order to generate this Go code. And if we then restart the server and go back to the list page, let's refresh the page and notice that we are not getting the properly formed response anymore. And the reason for that is if we go to handlers.go, we need to go to the list page here, the list handler, and we're going to change what's rendered. So rather than country list, let's now render countries. And we're still going to pass that slice of countries into that. So that's now the parent Templ component for the country list page. So don't forget to change that. And if we go back to the page and refresh, now we can see our rather archaic looking search bar. So there's template composition here. We have the base Templ component containing the HTML boilerplate. We then have the countries component that takes in a list of countries, and it has the search bar and also references another child component for the list itself. And what we want to happen here when we search in this search bar is we want to dynamically update the list below. And we want to use HTMX in order to do that. So let's dive in and see how we can achieve that using HTMX and Go. Now if we look at the handlers, we have this one at the bottom. It's called search countries. This is the one we're going to implement now. And if we look at the countries.templ file, this input here has a name of search. Now we want to send a GET request to the search endpoint, so we're going to use the hx_get attribute from HTMX, and we're going to send this to the /search endpoint, and that's going to match what we have here in this particular handler. Now we need to trigger this request, so if we go back here, we're going to add hx trigger, and this is essentially the event that's going to trigger the HTMX request. We want to do that every time the user types, so let's use the key up event. And we're going to use some modifiers here. So one of them is going to be the changed modifier. And we're also going to delay this by 1 second. Now to explain that, let's go back to the HTMX documentation for the hx trigger attribute. If we scroll down here, there's a section on event modifiers. And for the changed modifier, the event will only change if the value of the element has changed. And for delaying by 1 second, this delay will occur before an event triggers a request. And if the event is seen again, it's going to reset the delay. And this is important to avoid sending too many requests to your server every time the user types into the field. So for example, if we type into the field here, we don't want to send a request for every single key up event. So what we're saying here is delay the request by 1 second until the user has stopped typing. And only send the request if the input has changed. And that's going to stop, for example, if you type the escape key or something else. Anything that doesn't change the actual input is going to be ignored. And finally, we want to specify a target here using the hx target attribute. And the search results that we're going to get back, we want to place them into this country list div. So we're going to copy this ID here and reference that as the target. And it's going to be an ID, so we use that syntax there. We're going to see exactly what that does in a second. So we're going to look for a key of search in the GET request. Let's now go back to handlers.go and let's get that query from the URL. Again, we're going to use the request object, and that has a URL property, and we can get the query strings from that using the .query function. Now to get a particular query string, we can use .get, and the name that we are looking for here is the search query string. So we'll see exactly how that works in a second. What I also want to do is use the strings module in Go, and we're going to use the toLower function here. And let's just lowercase this value that's coming in. And that's going to allow us to more easily have a case insensitive search. And we can then set up a results variable, and that's going to be a slice of models.country. So any countries that are found when we actually perform this search are going to be added or appended into that slice. And we can now create a for loop, and again we're going to loop over the countries that we have hard coded. So let's copy this for loop here, and for each country that we're looping over, we're going to create an if statement, and we're going to use the strings module's contains function. So the contains function will report whether a substring is within S, and what I want to do again is use the strings.toLower function here, and we're going to lowercase the country name that we are looping over. The second parameter to the contains function is the substring, and that's going to be the query that we got from the URL on line 28. So we're checking, is that query string that we got from the search bar in the country name that we have here? If that's the case, what we're going to do in this if statement is append that country to the results. So let's reassign results here, and we're going to use the append function, and we can pass the results into that, and what we're appending to that is the country. Now the final thing we need to do is we need to return a response, and HTMX is going to swap that into the target. Now we have a list of these countries here, and if we look at countries.templ, we have this country list templ component that takes that slice. So what we can do is we can actually just render this particular templ component and return that as a response, and what's going to happen then is that the input element here is going to look at the target here, which is the country list, and it's going to replace that with the content from the response. So basically we take the entire list of countries that we have at the start. When we start searching, we're then going to filter it down, and we're going to pass a different set of countries in and render those and replace them on the user interface. So what we need to do in handlers.go is use the components module, and this time we're going to render the country list component, and we can pass the results into that and directly call render here. And we can pass that request context in as well as the response writer. Now we're going to stop this here, and I'm going to run templ generate. I'm not even sure I changed any of the templ components, but let's just run that anyway and restart the Go server. Now once the server's started, let's go back to the page and refresh this page. And if we start searching, for example, for Japan here, notice that it takes 1 second because of that delay, but that actually filters down the results that we have here to just Japan. And when we clear that out, we get back the original 3. So we now have this active search thing going on, and it's filtering down dynamically when we actually search in that, and it's using HTMX to send that GET request to the search endpoint. And then on the search endpoint, we get what the user has typed using this statement here on line 28. We then iterate over all of the countries in our database, and this is just in memory, but of course in a real application it would be a database. And we append those to this results slice, and then we're rendering the country list templ component here and passing those results in. So we have Go on the back end doing this searching, and we have the templ component for the country list here. And this corresponds to what we see on this page here when we actually search and when we look at the countries. And we also have the HTMX request coming from our input in a different templ component, And this is targeting that root element of the Templ component below, and it's sending this GET request whenever the user changes their input and stops typing. So it's a small example of how to integrate HTMX and Templ within this Go application as part of the GoTH Stack. And one thing we can also do, if we go back to the page, if there's no results to our search, what we can do is we can display a message. And it's very simple to do this using Templ, because when we have a Templ component as well as the for loop, we can also introduce if statements and conditional logic. So just before we iterate within the div, we can create an if statement here and look at the length of the countries that have been passed in. And only if that's greater than 0 do we want to iterate over those in the for loop. So let's bring these up to the line above. And we can also add else logic here. So I'm going to add an else clause, and what we can do is display a message. And let's just keep that simple, no countries found. We can save that and run Templ generate. And again, we can restart the Go server. And this time, if we go back to the page and refresh, when we type something that has no results, we're going to see that message. So I think this integration between HTMX and Templ, along with a Go backend, is actually really nice. It's very easy to do this and compose the different Templ components and add HTMX interactivity wherever you need it. And of course, you can imagine using 𝗷𝗫𝗀𝗃 as well if you want to add extra interactivity. That would be possible as well in these Templ components. So that's about it for this video. We've seen the main players in this GoTH stack. And of course, we could style the application a lot better by adding something like Tailwind CSS. And because of the way we've set this up, what we could do is just add the link to the Tailwind bundle here in the head tag of our base Templ component. And that's then going to be picked up by all of the other components that extend this base component. Again, this is taking advantage of the idea of template composition in the Templ package. Now, as I mentioned at the start, I want to build a larger scope application as part of a course, and that's going to use Go, Templ, and HTMX as we see them here, alongside other technologies such as Postgres, 𝗷𝗫𝗀𝗃, Tailwind CSS, and more. So let me know if you're interested in that and if you want to see anything in particular. And if you have any smaller scope requests, let me know as well in the comments. And if you found this content useful, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. And if you want to support this channel and see more of this content on YouTube, check out the Ko-fi page that we have in the description. And thanks again, guys, for watching. We'll see you in the next video.